Hi, everybody. This is Warren Herman. Tonight we're going to speak about an important subject that can help us in our lives in various ways. What we're going to speak about today is something that spans the different religious traditions of the world and also has resonance with a number of different approaches to psychological understandings of how we function. This approach is going to kind of illuminate ways in which we can look at some fundamental struggles that we can have in the spiritual life, in the interior life, and give us some ways of dealing with them. So, what we're going to begin with are some different some broad understandings of what we're talking about here and why we're talking about it. The essential problem that we're addressing in this video is the idea that there is a paradox between action and passivity, a paradox between the need to be engaged in the world and a need to have freedom and relaxation from the world. This is very important because in our lives, we can end up with some various problems that we can get into. We can get into parts of our lives where we essentially desire what Dr. Robert Augustus Masters is an integral psychotherapist, I believe. And again, this is not a psychotherapy video. This is not therapy. Don't sue me. This is just thinking and ideas and just chatting about stuff. But Robert Augustus Masters is an integral psychotherapy theorist type guy. I don't endorse the integral movement, and I have a different model and understanding of how the human person works. It comes from my Catholic understanding of the person. But there's this very interesting understanding that he has in his book, Spiritual Bypassing, because this approach that he talks about how when we are, maturing, there are different things we can end up doing that tend to make us regress back toward an undifferentiated pre-womb state of identity. And that's something that we seek to do. Like, let's say somebody may approach this through forms of Eastern meditation. Someone may approach this through the use of certain, through drinking or something like that. There's this desire to essentially, we can see that kind of imagery even in drinking, that return to the bottle, that return to the ultimate feminine, is this movement toward the return to the world of the mother, to the womb. And there's this other thing that we're trying to escape from, which is the world of the father, this harsh exterior reality of identity and action in the world. There's these two polarities, and often they seem to be in conflict. And this conflict between this regression of our identity and this progression of our identity seems to be insurmountable, at least in this linear model. And that's why ultimately I believe that we ultimately find our identity in God, and that there are paradoxes that are resolved in Christ and in God. There's so much to describe in this. This is too many things to try to make the appropriate connections here. But what I'm speaking about here, I'm going to go through a tour of different ideas about how do we balance this this type of thinking so that our action does not become a burden, so that our activity does not become something that leads to exhaustion. And so I want to just kind of cite different examples. For example, there's a book, Mental Efficiency Without Fatigue, in which Father Narciso Irala recommended a kind of model of action in which one would engage in action and then rest the mind, paying attention to what he called conscious sensations. So he had this kind of rhythm of action and inaction in order to achieve this kind of balance. But essentially, that's what we're trying to get at in this video. We're trying to look at how do we have that efficiency without fatigue. And it's this issue that is at the core of many different problems in the field of religion and even in the field of, for example, TMS treatment, for psychosomatic illness. And we're going to see this at play in various ways. We'll also see it at play in the world of psychotherapy. So, for example, in the teachings of, when people would come to receive therapy, sometimes people would, accept them, or try to change them. And based on these reactions, there would be different responses. And it was only Marsha Linehan who discovered this necessity of having a balance of acceptance and change, and her creation of dialectical behavior therapy. There's this need for both acceptance and change strategies. And this is, again, getting at the heart of this need for balance, this need for there to be both of these poles here. So that's one of the ways we can look at this. So we see this resonating with so many different things. And in order to kind of understand what we're getting at, I'm going to give some a kind of a humorous or a movie example. And then we're going to flesh it out with examples from the various spiritual traditions of the world, so we can see different kind of almost like layers of an onion of how this looks at varying levels of the human personality, varying ways of attempting to integrate these polarities. And that's something that I think will be very helpful to understanding this process of integration, because we'll really so I'll have this humorous thing. So I'll talk about Luke Skywalker for a moment. There's a powerful scene at the end of the first original Star Wars movie, A New Hope, where there is this instruction that Luke gets from Obi-Wan Kenobi, which is to turn off the targeting computer and use the Force. And that's essentially the shift that we're talking about here, is that we're moving from this sense of like overthinking to being in an engagement with life. And that's the essential thing here. This is also communicated by Obi-Wan Kenobi earlier in the movie when he makes this statement, "Let go your conscious self and act on instinct." And these things point toward this kind of authentic connection to our action, which implies what in Taoism we call doing, not doing. And we'll eventually get into that as we start taking this tour of different things that go through levels of this. So let me begin with an understanding. Maybe we'll start there with Taoism. In this Chinese philosophy of Taoism, there is this idea called Wu Wei, which is to do, doing, not doing. It says the Tao doesn't do anything, but it leaves nothing undone, basically. So there's this sense in which, if you observe someone doing Tai Chi, there's this sense in which they are kind of consciously moving, but they're flowing. It's not the same type of deliberate, like rational action. I don't necessarily endorse doing Tai Chi, but it was interesting. I once had a Tai Chi instructor in college, and he talked about how basically you play with it. It's understanding of play. You kind of are flowing with the action. You have to learn how to do it, but then you flow with it. You have this sense of flow. Doing, not doing, the balance between yin and yang, those masculine and feminine principles that we were emphasizing at the beginning of passivity and effort. So there is this essential way of doing this, and in Taoism, there is this sense in which your goal. It was interesting. I was watching a video where this kind of state of Wu Wei was compared to being drunk, and they talked about how it takes like that edge off. Again, like turning off that targeting computer and using the Force, being engaged and absorbed in the action, so that because you're so absorbed and focused on the action, this leads to a state of flow that seems very natural. Again, sounding very much like what Obi-Wan Kenobi said, let go your conscious self and act on instinct. So, moving right along, something that's very powerful also to understand is something that was practiced by Gandhi and is found in the Bhagavad Gita, which is the practice of karma yoga. Now, there are certain things that are distinct, about the Hindu context of the practice of karma yoga, such as, the understanding that, like, in the Hindu context, there's a sense in which God is one with everything, often in different, they divide to school and stuff like that. But there's obviously the Hindu context of this offering of one's actions to God. But in the Hindu context, there's this sense in which they say you are entitled to your action, but not to the fruit of your action. And one surrenders the fruits of one's action to God and does one's action as a devotion to God instead of as a means of achieving a goal. And so we see in this karma yoga, this yoga of action, this way of union through action, that there's again this type of way very similar to Wu Wei, in a slightly different philosophical context. We see this surrender and action, this yin and yang being blended in this practice. So that's another way of talking about it. In the Stoic tradition, we see this, as an expression of rationality, because that's what how they approach the world, is through this rational lens. They would say, okay, my intention is to go to the public bath and take my bath. But I have to remember that my intention is also to keep my mind in harmony with nature. My goal is not simply to take the bath. My goal is to accept whatever happens. And so there's this kind of double intention that is in Stoicism. When taking an action, it's not only to do the act, but to be in harmony with how it occurs. So again, this is another way of finding that doing, not doing at a different level. We're kind of going through, cutting through different levels of this and seeing how this works at different levels. And we can see also, this is something that if we kind of go into the Western religious landscape, we see very much this type of thinking is really at the key. This is really a key problem in the wrestling between Protestant and Catholic traditions. You see, there's, this wrestling between faith and works is very much related to this sense of striving. And the thing is that when we are really caught in the targeting computer, when we are caught in all this obsessive action, this exhausting action, it's very interesting if we look at the information that's available about Martin Luther, who founded Protestantism. It becomes, based on his own disclosures, it becomes clear that he has what we would today call a type of religious OCD known as scrupulosity. And so it's very interesting to realize that the type of overthinking that we're trying to work through by understanding the type of challenge we're trying to overcome in the interior life was very much the cause, in some ways, of the Protestant movement, because it was this desire to overcome the exhausting demands of action. Very much like we spoke about at the beginning, was this desire, how do we act without this action becoming a source of fatigue? How do we do that? And so eventually that comes out of the Protestant Reformation as a rejection of works, meaning that you have to believe in Jesus to go to heaven, essentially, but it's not about the things that you do. Of course, this becomes much more. I'm saying this in a very basic way, and I'm not showing this in a way that is has any subtlety or any theological. It's not being expressed on a appropriate level here. I'm just stating it in almost like a popular level, because we can go into a lot more detail. And of course, there's ways in which, eventually Calvin makes the formula. He says, you're saved by faith alone, but the faith that saves is not alone, meaning that there has to obviously be some type of result, in the of this. It's not, so there's different ways in which they try to understand this. And of course, the caricature of the Catholic position is one in which it is burdened by, this constant striving to do all these different works rather than trust in God. And so that is something that is, obviously it's a caricature of the Catholic tradition. There can be, obviously so it's not actually what the Catholic tradition is, but there's a way in which someone could possibly, can get that idea, or could fall into that error, or because of the nature of scrupulosity, can feel that will attach, can have their scrupulosity attached to Catholic faith in that kind of way. And it's important to notice that scrupulosity can attach to Protestant movements as well. It can cause us to try to start doubting whether we have enough faith. Just as much as it can doubt whether we've done the right works. It's an equal opportunity offender here. So it's something that doesn't necessarily get resolved by a change in beliefs, but gets resolved by actually a change in attitude. And so, we see this, and I want to just pause a second here to kind of note a psychological element to this. And this is in the teachings of Dan Buglio. Dan Buglio speaks about TMS and, these types of, and this is an applicable thing, this kind of perceived dangerous symptoms, which can be mental, physical, of all kinds of things. And the way that we kind of overcome perceived dangerous symptoms can be through having, certain tools and practices, but mostly by having the right mindset. And the thing is, this mindset versus tools, or this attitude and actions distinction, is very similar to this faith and works polarity that we're seeing throughout all these different levels. And it's important to realize this because when we understand really what we're talking about, when we're starting to get all this different language around this thing, we really start to see what we're dealing with and the exact nature of the problem that we're having, this kind of exhausting striving. We realize that what we need is the right attitude. We need an attitude that's detached and calm, in addition to one that involves the use of tools or actions. And so it's this kind of balance that we're looking for. Again, it's coming down to this balance that we're always seeking for. And to continue moving along and to understand, it's so important because when we understand these things, we end up overcoming these challenges, like our scrupulosity, or we end up, having a much more healthy, focused faith because we're engaging with life, we're living our faith. We're not stuck in our heads. We're turning off the targeting computer and we're using the force. We're coming into a real life. So that's why it's so important to understand these things. But the thing is, if we don't look at this from a perspective that has this type of psychological and this kind of broad cross-section of these different traditions, we'll actually maybe sometimes miss out on what this is really solving because we're not looking at all its anthropological implications, all these levels at which it's functioning in the human person. And we won't realize how much this is really a real struggle of what it means to be human, this polarity between this desire to be free and regress to being nothing, and this bondage that we seem to have where we have to be somebody in particular and have all these particular responsibilities that have no relief. But what we're really looking for is balance, and we're really looking for a real balance. And it's interesting because we see this balance as well, not only in these kind of maybe natural or attempted natural syntheses of doing and not doing that we've seen in these various traditions, we also see it emerging in various ways in Christian things. So I'm going to work my way up through some things. And it's interesting that you see, in the modern practice of speaking in tongues in the Pentecostal movement, we do see something that's very similar to doing, not doing. It's very interesting in a study that was done by, it was a study done by people from, I think it was Freedom Valley Worship Center. They did these studies of people in this state of and they were engaging in the Pentecostal experience of speaking in tongues, and they noticed that there were things they weren't actually generating speech. And so again, they were in a state where they were kind of entering into a flow, into absorption, into a doing, not doing, into a surrendered action. And it very much, it's kind of they entered into this flow. It's very interesting to realize this, seeing that in the Pentecostal tradition. And of course, I take some. I have some, some things that I might say, are not, I don't necessarily endorse that practice without making some qualifications. I don't necessarily endorse the practice of speaking in tongues like that. And that's a whole tons of videos to make on that subject. I think we have to be very cautious with those kind of things. That's just that's a caution, but I'm sharing it because we want to look at how does this play out in different traditions. And we see, of course, we talked about Protestantism, where eventually it kind of becomes, doing things as an expression of faith. That's kind of maybe a way we try to have this thing of okay, I'm not doing actions to earn going to heaven, but I'm doing actions to add a gratitude for it's kind of that kind of having and doing and kind of making a balance with that. And in Catholicism, we see, again, it's meant to be a participation. It's meant to be a participation in the love of God. We see various things, like the ABCs of salvation from the Marian Fathers of the Immaculate Conception. They talk about ask for mercy, be merciful to others, and completely trust in Jesus. We see this dynamism, which is kind of bringing these different yins and yangs together. We also can see this expressed, I want to also just notice the Orthodox tradition, for example. We see this balance, in their prayer tradition of what we call watchfulness, this detached watchfulness. They say to survey the thoughts is to calm them. Like there's this need, which is very similar to that mindset. We want to have that nepsis, that detached, that sobriety, that mindset of detachment. And then there's the Jesus prayer, which is repeated in that sober mindset. Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me, a sinner. So we see, again, attitude and action, faith and works, yin and yang. We see this, we see this type of that watchfulness and prayer. They also say prayer purifies watchfulness and watchfulness purifies prayer. We see again that expression in the Orthodox tradition of this what we've been talking about throughout this yin and yang. We also, in the Catholic tradition, there's a version of this prayer, like similar to the Jesus prayer, which is the ceaseless act of love, a Venerable Consolata Patrona. We see Jesus says to her in her diary, I will think of everything, you think only of loving me. And so we see this way in which he encourages her to have this complete blind trust in him while repeating this ceaseless act of love, which is Jesus, Mary, I love you, save souls. Jesus, Mary, I love you, save souls. And he makes many wonderful promises about this participation in love, such as that a soul will be saved every time it's stated, that we will be restored to a state of grace. If we fall into sin, we'll be restored to a state of grace because we're participating in this perfect act of love. There's so many beautiful principles involved in the practice of that prayer. But the point that I'm making here is that, again, we see that yin and yang. I will think of everything. You think only of loving me. Trust and surrender. There's a Bible verse that says, trust in the Lord and do good. It's like that's these two polarities. C.S. Lewis said when he talked about faith and works, he compared them to two sides of a scissor. And he said that's kind of like asking which one is better for cutting. Like you can't really separate faith and works. And I think that what we've gone through is this kind of panoramic description of this yin and yang theme, these two sides of the scissors throughout various psychological levels, in order to understand their purpose, to understand that what this is all about is finding a real pathway to synthesis, a real way of union and action, so that our action is not only a balance between polarities that are created, but a balance between our action and divine action. And so it's almost like as we move through these levels, we see this shift from, the symbolism of the yin and yang, which is similar to that medicine wheel, in the Native American tradition. It's like those different corners of the world coming together, those opposites coming together in synthesis, in that Wu Wei, doing, not doing. And eventually we come to things like, Sister Consolata's, a ceaseless act of love, which you see as a synthesis not only of those created things that are taken up into this synthesis, but also of God's action within the person, that love, that participation in divine love as well, which is inspiring the prayer and is the substance of the prayer and is doing the action of the prayer. And also there's that surrender and there's that action. So there's this human elements and these divine elements. So it's not only a synthesis of the created opposites in the vertical synthesis, but also a horizontal synthesis of Wu Wei, so to speak. So this is a way of looking at this problem and how this is dealt with at various psychological levels so that we can understand how do we apply it to our struggles. It means that when we are repeating these prayers, we have to actually do this. We have to surrender. We have to say, okay, like I'm not in control. Because we can repeat the ceaseless act of love, for example, but be so attached to say, oh, I need to do this because I'm going to hell. I hope I'm doing it right. Oh no, maybe it's not real. We have to turn off the targeting computer and use the force. We have to be able to let go our conscious self and act on instinct. We have to be able to understand what this practice is, to be able to have that ability to trust in the Lord and do good. That's what we're trying to do here. And then, it'll go well with us. And I think that's a paraphrase of the end of that scripture. So I hope this video is helpful and is useful to you in overcoming that overthinking, that overthinking that can be found in scrupulosity, that overthinking that can be found in anxiety about things and obsessive thinking, and can be useful to you in so many ways. Because then we understand that we don't have to have action be a burden. And it's really beautiful because it also, one of the things that I wanted to mention in closing here is this idea, St. Maximilian Kolbe, for example, when he was taken to Auschwitz, he had this experience where they announced to him that the Nazis were about to take him. He says, yes, mother. He receives his sufferings from the hands of his nurturing heavenly mother. And this is the thing that we have to do. We have to, in all of our sufferings, we have to find a way to, we have to balance the yin and yang. Think about even the Franciscan habit, the habits of the, there's one order that has the Franciscans, the Immaculate. They have this blue habit, and the Franciscan habit has been said to resemble the cross. And it's also blue for their mother. So it's like your mother is clothing you in this instrument of torture. So your mother is protecting you under the blueness of her veil, which is also the cross of her son. It's like, so there's this synthesis. And this is what we're trying to live out. We're trying to become a synthesis of these polarities, these polarities to become this horizontal and vertical integration of all things, to become like another incarnation of the Word, to become, to be all these things. We have to become, all these things. And it's such an amazing, far-reaching concept. And I hope that this is helpful in very practical ways, because when we understand that this is what we're trying to do, we're trying to kind of let go of that overthinking and then focus on our action. That's what it's about. This is something that we see even in the books like, The Cloud of Unknowing. The Cloud of Unknowing is a mystical text which says, put all the concerns under the cloud of forgetting and knock with a single word. So you gather all your desire and all your prayer into that single word and knock on the cloud of unknowing. We have to let go of all that stuff. Again, it's all the same. Let go your conscious self and act on instinct. And this is beautiful because if you look at the work of, I think it's Csikszentmihalyi is a psychological writer. He talks about entering into a state of flow. And this is so important because when we enter into a state of flow, there is this creativity. There is all those things like that. And so he talks about that necessity for absorption and things. And we're looking for that on the highest levels. And so this is our fulfillment, is to be involved in a state of flow and to be involved in a state of flow that integrates all things horizontally and vertically in Christ. And so this is something that I hope is very helpful to understanding this need, so we can understand the words that Christ says to us, come unto me, all you who are burdened and you're heavy laden, and I will give you rest. And finding that type of action that he said, apart from me, you can do nothing. Finding the type of action that he calls us to, so that we do actions in him, in his love, from his love. There's a thing that says that God is at work in you to will and to work, for his good pleasure. There's all these, I'm paraphrasing here because probably in some ways, but the thing is, there's this way in which we are meant to enter into this participation in the love of God, vertical and horizontal, leading beyond the exhaustion of action into a state of flow. So I hope this is helpful to your spiritual life, to overcoming interior challenges of overthinking and agonizing over things, so you can invest yourself in prayer, invest yourself in engagement in life, invest yourself in what is happening. because it's so important. All these things, even the treatments for things like the 4 steps of OCD treatment from Dr. Schwartz. And again, this is not a therapy video. Don't sue me. Not a replacement for medical treatment. Dr. Schwartz makes these 4 steps for OCD, and the main step, is to revalue. It's about revaluing, relabeling, understand. Okay, these are just obsessive thoughts that I don't need. Turn off the targeting computer, and then engage in life. You engage in life. And so that's always the final step. Is always about engaging in life. Turn off the targeting computer. Use the force. Place everything under a cloud of forgetting. Knock with a single word on the cloud of unknowing. Pray to God with that one prayer. These are all the same teaching. The DARE response. There's these different ways that they kind of work through things. They say, okay, these are different ways of working through things, but always it's this last step is engage in life. They have all these different methods of treating things, but they're all the same thing, because Christ is calling us, come, all you who are weary and burdened and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Of course, I'm paraphrasing, but this is how we do it. We understand what's trying to be said to us, what we're being invited to. So hopefully this is helpful to you in your interior growth.